To Athens-Clarke County City Hall for the official beginning of budget season. We're here on March 24th, 2026, and we're here for our FY27 Strategic Alignment and Budget Priorities Gathering. And so if Manager Bob Cowell already had been swimming in the deep end, he's about mid-Atlantic right now, and he's looking for treasure on the ocean floor. And so I'm going to turn it over to Manager Cowell so he can take us through kind of our initiation into this process. Of course, we'll get to the point later in the meeting where we and everybody who's watching will be able to see the coming budget meeting schedule. But I'll let him take it away. So Manager Cowell, thanks for being here.
Thank you. And yes, treasure would be nice. We could use always more treasure as well, stuff. So first, obviously, almost 8 months in. So this is my first budget with you all. And so still learning the process. Thankfully, you have a very good staff that helps me along the way with this. So I very much appreciate it. I told someone earlier that often when you're coming into kind of a new community, doing the budget often feels like you walked into a house where there's all kinds of drawers and rooms filled with invoices and different pots of money, and you're trying to figure out how they all go together. It definitely feels like that here, trying to figure out all those pieces as well. So certainly appreciate your patience and grace. This presentation is longer probably than I would prefer. It's definitely longer than Brad's last presentation, so apologize for that as well. Yeah, so and that's okay. There's a lot of things to cover as well. I do want to thank a few folks before I kind of launch into this. Certainly want to thank the staff with Budget and Strategic Analysis Department, the Finance Department, and within my office as well. Couldn't get this far, and we still have a lot of work to do, but couldn't get this far without their help. Certainly want to acknowledge the department directors, the charter officers, and the elected officials, pretty much all of whom actually took time to meet with us through this process over several weeks as well. And want to thank each of you also, because you helped set the priorities that are referenced in this document. At the end of the day, you provide us the funds that we need to move forward. And then finally want to thank and acknowledge the taxpayers and ratepayers, because they're actually the ones that give us all the money that allows us to do and deliver the services that ultimately they need in their community. So want to acknowledge that. With that, there's a number of points that I hope to cover as quickly as I can through this presentation. And those are included on the screen. I'm not going to go through every single one of them. These are sort of the table of contents, if you will, as we move our way through this presentation. Not going to read the purpose statement. It hasn't changed. This is essentially the same purpose statement that has been used for a number of years as to what the purpose of this project or this presentation is. I will read the top line, which is the purpose is to inform the mayor and the commission of major expenditures or revenue challenges, changes, or other issues potentially impacting the ability to advance on strategic priorities with the upcoming budget and future budget. What has in the past been lovingly referred to as big rocks, and that may be the only time I actually reference big rocks in here. I'm trying to use a different terminology, but that is what we're here for, is to identify those big things that we need to kind of know about as we work through the development of the budget itself.
Can I stop you for 1 minute?
Yes.
Tiffany wanted to call in. Can we call? Is that necessary? She wanted to call. She just sent me a text.
You have to have a quorum
Oh, okay. All right, I'll text her back.
to
Okay.
participate in that
Okay.
matter.
All right. Thank you. Sorry.
Oh, no worries, no worries.
Get on replay.
Once long ago, one of the colleagues I worked with in budgeting had this mantra, which is, okay, before we launch into it, let's begin with the end. So I'm doing that. So this is probably what you would have in the past considered sort of the big rocks. And so I want to kind of quickly go through this, and the rest of the presentation will actually kind of explain these numbers a bit further, how we got there and what we're using them for, and so on. But to kind of begin with this ending, we have a projected about $6.4 million of, if you will, new general fund for FY27. For those of you that have been around for other budgets may recognize that is a fair amount less than what we've had in the past. And it's kind of an indicator of what you've heard over the last couple of years, which is while revenues continue to grow, they're growing at a slower rate. And there's a more detailed table you'll see in a few minutes that kind of explains where that growth perhaps has slowed the most. So for that $6.4 million of new funds, we received about $6.7 million in requests to meet contractual and inflationary cost increases, or what here we would refer to as those that are over limit within the budget. We received about $8 million, 6.5 of which is in the general fund. For new initiatives, that included at least 60 positions proposed or requested in the general fund, 75 positions or so overall. Over $100 million in capital needs, with 41 million of those coming from the general fund. So needless to say, the requests far exceed the revenues we have. No surprise, that's pretty much probably what it's going to always be as well. But it is an indicator of how need continues to outpace the revenues that we have available. What I'm moving forward and kind of proposing and working with the mayor to kind of develop on a budget that will come to you all has about 5.6 million, of which 4.2 million comes from general funds for compensation increases. And again, I'll go into detail on each of these through subsequent slides. About $3 million of general fund for contractual inflationary costs. That does not cover all of those inflationary contractual increases. So the remainder will need to come from reallocation of existing budgeted funds, which again, I'll talk about in a few minutes. Just under $1 million for new initiatives. That includes a few new positions, but not many, and even those on the general fund side are really being made available by actually eliminating vacant positions to try to actually free up those dollars for new positions. The others will come from other sources of funding, but even in those other sources of funding, similarly, we're trying to reduce the number of long-term vacant FTEs, and I'll come back to that again here in just a few minutes. Recommending somewhere around $60–70 million of new capital. Most of that obviously is not in general fund. General fund has about $7.5 million of capital, almost all oriented toward life cycle, and again, we'll talk about that a bit further.
Did you say six? What was the number? You said?
67, and it,
Okay, I thought you just,
Yeah.
you said what's written here.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
that's
and
all.
that it'll make sense when we get further in
Okay,
because
yeah,
it's
that's fine.
mostly in areas that are not general fund. Obviously, it's in areas like, for example, utilities, SPLOST, those kinds of things, stuff as well. And then this does continue the practice, as has been, good or bad, of the use of general fund balance. The reality is we would be unable to do any general funded capital projects if we didn't rely somewhat on the fund balance. You all have heard this in the past few budgets where that's not a desired practice necessarily, certainly not for operational purposes. And at some point, there comes an end because you have used all of the excess dollars that you have in that fund balance before you bump up against that, that requirement that we have for some operating dollars that are held in reserve there. And we are essentially at that point after this budget. If ultimately $8 million is moved, there's about $5 to $6 million above the limit with that, and that's pretty much done. So we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Again, not surprisingly, many needs remain unmet, and really our current approach, which is take new dollars and add fund balance into the mix, really isn't sustainable. It's going to end soon, and I think that soon is coming very soon with it. More cost and fiscal uncertainty are ahead, everything from House Bill 1116 and what it may do or not do to whatever's going on in the national and even international economy. One really good example is the price of fuel that we're having to purchase continues to escalate and has no end clearly in sight. There'll certainly be more uncertainty like that as we go forward. And the last point I want to make is the budget's a lot more than the general fund. We'll talk here a lot about the $200+ million that's general fund, but I don't want to forget that this is really ultimately about a $350 million budget and much more capital on top of that. Sometimes I think we forget just how much we're responsible for as we work on the budget because we focus in, understandably, so much on the general fund. So that's the end, if you will, and the rest of the presentation will cover the details of that, and I'll come back to that slide again at the very end as well. Lots of things go on with the budget process, obviously, to get us to this point. I'm not going to go through all of these. You've been present at most of these, which are everything going from the retreats in the fall and in January, all the way up to the meetings that took place with all the departments, constitutional and elected officials as well. I also think that it's important to, before we launch into really the details of the FY27 budget to talk a little bit briefly about what has taken place in the current fiscal year with money that you've approved in this and previous budgets. And so the images on these next two slides just kind of highlight what those investments have resulted in. Obviously, the majority of the money that you provide through the budget goes to the people that provide the services that are necessary to deliver within the community. Those range from answering 911 calls, the buses run every day, the trash gets collected and safely disposed of, safe drinking water is provided to most of our front doors, potholes are filled, youth recreation programs are provided, courts conducted, fires are put out, and crimes are investigated, and a lot more. That's really the key centerpiece of what goes on in the budget. However, we also saw this year the delivery of two key apparatus for the fire department, the opening of the real-time crime center, the refurbishing of a number of athletic courts, experienced a significantly lower rate of violent crime, expanded affordable housing options, enhanced solid waste services, and we continue to progress on our sustainability efforts and much more. And again, I just use those two slides and just those brief moments to sort of remind everyone why it is that we even have these budget discussions. We have these to make certain that we have dollars available to achieve the priorities that are necessary and to deliver the services that our residents have come to rely upon. In a well-done budget environment, these decisions are rooted in strategic priorities. So they're rooted in your, really what you're trying to accomplish on behalf of the residents. And of course, over a course of years, and most recently over 2 retreats, you've identified this collection of strategic priorities. You're familiar with the most recent retreat in January, that you kind of, underneath each of these are a set of specifics that are designed to implement these as they move forward. But these are critical for us to be aware of as we develop the budget going forward. You are also aware that, with my arrival here, one of the things you asked me to do is to kind of lay out a plan of action for the next couple of years. I've referred to that as ACC Forward and have shared that with each of you as a group, as well as most of you, if not all of you, individually. And the collection of items that are on the screen are really those top priorities, many of which are drawn out of your strategic plan. Others are drawn out of conversations that we've had or that have come up in my assessment of the organization as we kind of move forward. You take all of that together, all of those priorities, take a look at current fiscal conditions and all of those kinds of things combined, and you arrive at what I considered kind of the top priorities that I had in place as I crafted kind of these ideas to provide to the mayor so that he can develop his budget moving forward. And I just want to touch on these really briefly, but one is alignment. Again, making certain that what we're doing through the budget aligns with what you've identified as your priorities and what I've identified in the in kind of my 2-year plan moving forward. The second one was taking care of the people who provide the services, and that's where we get into discussions regarding compensation and benefits. And then the third is contractual and inflationary obligations. Everything costs more. Everything costs even more in government, and so we have no choice. We have to meet those obligations in order to keep our services running. Good examples of those are utility bills continue to increase. We have to pay utility bills. The fourth is addressing facilities, vehicles, and equipment that we also rely upon for services. You all have talked a lot over the years about life cycle and kind of deferred maintenance and the costs with those and advancing on those. While we've made good strides in that, we still have a lot to do and a long way to go with those. The fifth is enhancing transparency and clarity. You all have been getting, over the last couple of months, monthly budget updates, and you'll continue to get those. You will also see the actual document that we help craft for the budget will be more comprehensive than it has been in the past. I think it's really important that the budget be the one place that our residents and you all can go to understand, regardless of the source of funding, what we're spending money on. So inside there, for example, you'll see what capital projects are proposed regardless of source. So you'll see what's general fund proposed, you'll see SPLOST and T-SPLOST proposed for that year and so on. Those are examples of ways in which we're trying to increase that clarity of what we're spending money on and why, and the transparency of what we're spending money on. The sixth is essential government service delivery first. What that means is there are some decisions before you that are likely to involve tough choices. We support a lot of folks outside of our walls, if you will, outside of the government, and they do great work. It's a point at which we need to start evaluating those relationships and determining how much of that can we continue to do if it starts, and I'm not saying it necessarily is, but if it starts to compromise our ability to meet our objectives, or not objectives, but our responsibilities. And then the last one is really, while we're building this budget, trying to prepare for known and unknown upcoming cost increases. And I'll talk more about those as we kind of move our way through that. This is a slide that you've seen some version of in the past. There's more red on it than there ideally should be or would be, but it is it's an approach that we've tried to manage over now what will be probably the fourth year going forward. And so, we expect, as I said, revenues to increase, but they are not increasing at the rate in which our expenditures are increasing. And it essentially leaves us in a position where if we stayed within those and did not look to fund balance, we would have to make choices like, do we do pay increases or not? Do we actually try to do anything relative to life cycle maintenance, deferred maintenance or not? So once again, we will be proposing in this that we'll hand off to the mayor some use of that fund balance. And I'll come back to this with a little more detail to kind of explain what I see as the consequences of that and what I see as perhaps some of the things we're going to need to be thinking much more seriously about over the course of the next year.
Bob, I have a question on that, just informational for my helping.
Sure.
Is it okay if I ask you that now? Okay, on the
Yeah, if you have
previous one.
clarifying
Yes,
questions, yeah.
Yeah, the net change in fund balance surplus deficit, that implies that there's some zero. There's some like place where the optimum, where it would be zero. What is that, what is that number?
Yeah,
Is it based on the last,
There's a slide that I'll get to that will show that piece. So, yeah. So
Okay.
hold tight. So
okay, well, just remind me when we get to that.
zero,
slide.
though, is a bad number. So
No, I know that's not it, but obviously,
there
it
is
looks
a-
like it's a positive. Right.
yeah, effectively what there is there is a minimum policy line, basically,
Right.
that we cannot drop below, and you'll see how we are compared to that.
But we never go below that, I thought.
We
Okay,
have
we'll come
not,
to that.
and we try not to,
Okay,
yes.
we'll get to that, we'll get to that
Yep.
slide, and I'll look at it again.
This slide is busy as it is. You can almost barely not make out. There's actually a pale blue kind of blob, if you will, behind those dark blue lines, and that's actually the important line. What this is showing is that while you can look at kind of revenue that we have budgeted for or realized over the years, and fortunately, we are growing our revenues. In the course of 5 years or so, there was growth of about $48 million in revenue, which is not insignificant. However, that buying power of that growth is eroded, just like it is for all of us, it is eroded by inflation. And so that $48 million has a buying power significantly less, somewhere around $15 or so million. So over the course of that 5 years, even though revenues are growing, what we can buy with that revenue keeps kind of chipping downward, if you will. Again, no different than what each of us deal with in our households or at our businesses. The one difference perhaps is that the things that we buy tend to outpace even the CPI. So if you think of folks that go out and buy a car, they've gotten a lot more expensive than they have. Fire trucks have gotten significantly more expensive, just using that one as an example of the kinds of things that we purchase. This actually drills down a bit further.
I'm sorry, Bob, would you please repeat the last sentence? The things that we buy are more
They accelerate, so the
Accelerate.
inflation with those have tended to pace faster than CPI. What I'm showing up there is actually CPI. So in some ways, I would say the buying power is probably eroded even deeper than that part of it.
Thanks.
Sure. This slide shows the general fund revenue item that I shared with you in its totality down at the individual level of the fund that the revenue is coming through. The two I want to draw the most attention to, obviously, are our two largest, which are property tax and sales tax. So you all know that over the years, last few years, property taxes, of course, revenues have been increasing at 8-9+ kind of % range. It basically is increasing slightly above the inflation rate currently. So thankfully it's growing, but certainly growing at a rate less than what it has been in the past. Sales tax, though growing, is actually growing at a rate slower than inflation. And so, again, if I use the buying power kind of example, we're actually losing ground around sales tax with it year over year growth associated with it. So overall, the general fund has grown or is projected to grow essentially at the rate of inflation. That would be probably okay if, again, all of those contractual obligations and other things similarly were growing at that rate, which they are not. They're growing at a rate in excess of that 3% roughly of inflation associated with it. Now, one caveat I'll put on here that you all know as well, the property tax revenue projections that we have on here are what we know at the moment. The digest, of course, is not finished for some time later. And I'll talk a little bit about some thoughts relative to if you see those dollars increase, what might be the appropriate way to sort of think about those as you go forward. So I'm going to dive just a little bit deeper and give some specific examples of what is in kind of the proposal moving forward in each of those 7 priority categories that I identified in there. I'm not going to go through every one of these, but in the first one regarding about caring for our people, we've baked into what you've seen in these numbers up to a 4% market rate increase for general government staff, a 3% adjustment in the public safety step pay plan, and that would include, of course, their step plans as well. Not anticipating needing to pass any costs on to the employees relative to health insurance. I believe that's the 4th year in a row that we've been able to propose that. 3 years you've been able to do that. In the second category about those contractual and inflationary obligations, I'll just give a few examples and kind of the sense of the magnitude of these. So much of what we have is on kind of license agreements or annual kinds of contract agreements. So for example, body cameras, we have body cameras with our officers, and that contract is slated to increase $400,000. What is it? $477,000. Last year, I think it was, the legislature passed a law that requires, if anybody's ever seen, you can now have your driver's license electronic with it, and we now have to have the ability to actually read those driver's license. Every officer has to have that ability, so we have to buy that equipment. It's like $125,000 to buy that equipment. Those are examples of costs that are increasing that we have to absorb, along with utility bills, motor fuels, basic things like postage, printing, and so on. Probably one of the most significant actually revolves still around medical care for those folks that are incarcerated or otherwise supervised by us. And again, talk about that as we go forward with this. Taking care of what we have, much of this you're familiar with, which are kind of those life cycle funding items around facilities, vehicles, equipment, asset management. The way I would describe that the investments that we've been able to make and are able to make are essentially letting us tread water, I guess I would say, maintain the status quo, which is not a good place to be, but it's better than it getting worse, but it's not getting a whole lot better. A little bit on aspects of the fleet, like the fire apparatus, for example, but in terms of many of our other things, we're just kind of maintaining status quo. We have some radio, a large number of radios that need to be replaced under the contract. Custodial services go up, sometimes just because of the cost, sometimes because we actually take on a new building, and we have to actually have custodial services associated with those. There are slight increases that are associated with different kinds of accreditation activities, for example, that when we have to go through an accreditation review, there's a cost associated with that, and so on. Those are some examples of the kinds of things that fall into that category. The enhancing transparency and clarity I mentioned already a little bit, which are funds that would go toward ACCGov 101, which is running very successfully this year, but we didn't have a budget for it, so we need to go ahead and put the budget into it. Things like the A to Z guide that often you all use, being able to print enough of those that we have those, being able to address open records and more efficiently than perhaps we've been able to, expanding some of our community engagement and outreach efforts, and those, all of those take a little bit of money, not as significant, and some of them will come from reallocation of existing dollars that we have within the budget already as well. This one about the essential government services first. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this one because this is where we start to have some potential impact on those outside of our walls that I want to kind of talk about, and somewhat inside also. But the first one is kind of the reimagining of the capital project delivery system. So you all have made it very clear in all the meetings that we've had of the desire to actually increase our ability to manage our capital projects and reduce our reliance on outside consultants to do so. We have had many, many years of reliance on outside consultants, and so we have begun that transition. And so there are a couple of project manager positions that are included in the budget proposal, and the equivalent of what is a county engineer in that as well. Good news is those positions can be funded through sources that are not general fund. So they can be funded through stormwater utilities, they can be funded through SPLOST, T-SPLOST, and so on. This is, in my mind, probably the first of a 2-year effort. It'll take us at least 2 years, I think, to get fully staffed to the point at which we'll be prepared to assume responsibility, starting most likely with those T-SPLOST 27 projects that get approved as we go forward. So that's kind of in that reimagining sort of
Would you want
piece.
us to wait until you're into your presentation?
Yeah, unless there's like clarifying kind of question.
Okay.
That would be helpful.
Well, if it's clarifying, on the reimagining, do we have a budget number on how much we will save allocation as we move away from the outside? Do we have a dollar amount?
We can get I would say we can get a version of that. I would say that initially it's actually going to cost us more because initially we've got to build up the capacity so we can start to wind down the capacity. So yes, I think we can get you a kind of a magnitude of what those ultimately could be with those. So yeah. The second one deals with reallocating discretionary funding, vacant positions, and unused expenditure lines. So discretionary funding falls into the category of those mostly outside agencies or partners that you're not obligated to actually fund. So there's some things like Advantage Behavioral, the Regional Commission, that you have some level of obligation to fund. There are other things like neighborhood leaders, the Community Partnership Program, and others where that's purely up to your discretion as to whether you fund those or not. Those two examples I just gave are about $2.2 million worth of funding that is not used internally but is actually directed externally that comes from the same source of funding, comes from general fund. Vacant positions. So one of the things that we're doing is looking at long-term vacant positions and evaluating whether those positions, frankly, have any hope of being filled. Many of those have already been stripped, if you will, of their salary amount in it. So the only thing that's really in there are the benefit amounts. So we don't realize the full benefit of sort of, if you will, unfunding those, but we do realize some benefit. So we are currently going through those, and the first pass of it was to try to identify some of those that could be used then to actually fill new needed positions that are necessary so that we don't have to add to the general fund in doing that. And then there are some unused expenditure lines. This is kind of a painful exercise for the departments to do, but I'm going to give you a really good example of this. So let's say we budget $100,000 for utilities, and the utility bill comes in at $200,000. That department partly foregoes some other line items that they were approved for in order to pay some part of that utility bill. So they may not be doing professional development. They may not be purchasing some small piece of equipment or whatever it might be, so they can pay part of that utility bill. And then what they can't do, our contingency account kind of closes the gap. So what we're ultimately saying is that in the departments that have consistently lines that are not spent, they're going to need to reallocate those dollars to try to cover more of those contractual obligations. Part of that, it goes back to that transparency piece again, because what that means is, in my example, if I actually have to allocate $200,000 for utilities, you're going to see some line items that we all would like to see funded. They're going to say zero. But right now, I think the impression is, oh, it's all okay. They're going to have professional development and they got utilities, and the reality is they're not actually spending them. They're not able to spend money in certain lines because they're having to cover those other costs. It's an exercise the departments, some of the departments are not going to like, because it really means that dollars that they certainly hope to use and would otherwise use are going to have to be moved into other categories in order to cover what some of these expenses are. Some departments can't do that. Some departments don't have any lines that aren't consistently underused or could be shifted across those. And that's why you see kind of that split of $3 million or so that are going to contractual and $3 million or so that are having to come from this kind of adjustments as we move forward. And then the final one is increasing funding to support economic growth. So we have largely underfunded our efforts at actual economic development within the community. We don't have much money that if we get a prospect, say Meissner, for example, coming into the community that is looking for some kind of assistance with a utility extension or something associated with that, we don't typically have dollars available for that piece. The proposal that I'm putting forward includes two components. One, funded from dollars we already have, which is a strategic plan for economic development, and the other is an increase in dollars that would go to the Economic Development Fund so that we start to build up our ability to actually be able to accommodate and attract high-paying, job-creating uses into the community.
I got another
Sure.
question. On the economic funding, and maybe it's back here, we have never talked about different avenues to bring in revenue. I know that Commissioner Wright has some thoughts about property, but I do remember when Commissioner Fisher talked about impact fees. And I drove by the poultry plant today, and we still own that Barber Street parking deck. I know there's 1,000 cars parked in there. So is there going to be a place that we can brainstorm or get some ideas out of the regular plans that we can look at other ways of bringing revenue?
Yes.
And it may be in here.
Yes, no, and I would say there's two ways that we really should be doing that going forward. One of which is the committee you all already have kind of addressing, which is land that we have available that either we could repurpose for some other use, or, and this is the second part of it, or to make land available, and the example that you've given is one of these, where through like a land swap or some other kind of thing, we could actually make available for the explicit purpose of generating some kind of economic activity. A good example is we've talked about kind of a location for the courthouse. We have multiple properties downtown. Once we commit to that land and move forward with it, it makes sense that we look at the other parcels and say, what can we do with those other parcels to make them available to see if they would generate some additional economic activity? So yes, and some part of that strategic plan that I'm talking about with economic development would cover and discuss that as well.
Okay, thank you.
The sort of the other category that I had in there is that sort of preparing for what may come next. Again, not going to go through a whole lot of this, but I do want to touch on a couple of these, which is the top one. We've talked about using kind of the fund balance, and what I'm sort of ultimately ending up kind of proposing is part of the fund balance being used in order to once again advance on our general capital needs, but really needing to guard the other piece. I think the closer we get and try to maintain to that 20% number instead of the 16% that's set by policy, the better we will look when we go out for credit ratings, which we will be doing if we are successful in moving forward with the Justice Center and any kind of debt that's associated with moving forward. So I think that fund balance, never mind the fact that it's coming to its end of what we can use anyway in terms of excess, but I think the more we can do to shore it up, the better we will look in those credit ratings, and therefore the better our rates will be on any kind of borrowing that we will do, which will result in real savings associated with it. There are a number of funds that we need to continue to leverage, some of which we haven't yet even begun to talk about. So the opioid settlement, for example, will be coming forward in a few months to kind of talk about how do we actually advance on those dollars and what would those best be used for. We've talked about the Justice Center design, and that as that project moves forward, there's going to be still the ongoing maintenance of the existing courthouse and then eventually the refurbishment of that. We'll be talking with you all most likely in May and June about more detailed plans relative to the Justice Center and the next steps moving forward. We have, looking ahead, the compensation study is going to be coming in, and it's going to share with us how far off market we might need to be, or might be, and therefore need to close that gap. We have a union, and that union in Georgia gets to negotiate with us every single year. And it's highly unlikely that those negotiations aren't going to always result in some additional cost of some variety with that. You all know that every time we do a capital project that's SPLOST funded, T-SPLOST funded, or other funding, there's always a line in there that talks about the operational cost impacts associated with it. Not as often do those costs actually get funded. So when a new pool opens, when the new library opens, there are real costs that will be attached with that. This budget right now does not yet need to incorporate much money for the library. The next budget will, and it will be substantive. So those are future things that we're going to have to account for. And then I've already talked a little bit about the slowing revenue and the uncertainty at kind of the state and federal level and how we prepare for that as well. So those were kind of some of the examples and kind of the details of the expenditures that are in what ultimately I'm proposing in the budget that will go to the mayor. This is a little bit more of a kind of an accumulation, if you will, of the various costs that, again, a slide that you're typically used to seeing. If you go back and kind of use your math again and say, well, we had $6.4 million of new money and we've got $10.7 million of expense, that's where you start to get into the discussion of that fund balance. And, and we're perilously close, if not crossing over into a line that I'm very uncomfortable with, which is any kind of ongoing costs coming out of that fund balance. And so we will continue as we work with the mayor on what budget he proposes. We're going to continue to look for those opportunities for savings inside the existing budget so that we can move those dollars and try to minimize what we're taking out of the fund balance. And again, there may be a few of those things that I'll talk about here in in a few moments. This is, I think, Commissioner Myers, this was the question that you were sort of asking about with the fund balance. So the fund balance is that line that's up there is effectively, if you will, the 0 point. So it is the point with which we do not want to go below, because going below it, one, violates the policy and causes other things come into place. And the second is it's kind of an alarm bell, if you will, to credit rating agencies and others that there's something kind of going on. You see in 22 and 23, we were generating surpluses. So revenues were exceeding projections and expenditures were slower than anticipated. And so the fund balance was growing. And then there was a point at time which you all looked at it and said, hey, in order to catch up on some of these things and get some other work done, we need to start pulling some of those dollars into general fund, life cycle, deferred maintenance, those kinds of things. The dollar amount that's needed to maintain, at least in the current budget, to maintain that line, if you will, for policy is around $35.5 million. So if we're projecting that at the end of 27, we would have $41 million in it, you can see how close we are to that 35+ million, 35.5 million line. So we're getting very close. That's why I think it's really important that if whatever fund balance we do use, we really not look at what's left in that gap, that we try to preserve as close to that 20% number as we possibly can going forward. Now, again, if revenues come in 26 in a surplus position, it could help us with this a little bit, but right now the budget's kind of tracking pretty close to what expenditures and revenues we're anticipating as we go in. Again, this is probably, my guess is, the last year that we can really rely on this as a way in which to kind of address those general capital. We're at a point that we really can't come into fund balance any further. And again, at the end, I have a few ideas and thoughts about how we might wrestle with some of that. None of which is going to be popular, by the way. This is a little bit easier way to deal with it, but not a great way to deal with it.
And when you do your report on the fund balance, what included in our budget, the official budget report, will there be a page dedicated to what and how much we have taken from the fund balance?
Oh, yeah, definitely. We can definitely do. Yeah, I mean, you can kind of see that if you look at, more or less, if you look at that top kind of line on there, you get an idea of what was coming out each year on the fund balance.
I'm more interested in the,
How we spent
yeah.
On what was?
it. On how we spent it, the details.
Oh, okay, what it was spent on.
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. most, if not all, and we can give you the details, was spent on those life cycle and deferred maintenance items. But
Okay.
we'll get you that,
Okay.
that information.
I get, the
Sorry.
question that I had here that I still have is why this is called a deficit. If we're still above what we need, why do people, because I hear people say this in the public, that this is a deficit budget. And I'm
Yeah.
like, we were still above the fund balance each time. Now, maybe we were closer than, it's nice when you have a whole lot of money, right?
Yeah,
But we still had money there. So why is it called a
Yeah, because
deficit
if you think-
budget, or is that a misuse?
If you think
the
of
word?
this as, for lack of a better description, think of this as a savings account. So it's sitting
Right.
and it's fixed, so it's
Yeah.
there. And you think of the general fund, those are active revenues that are coming in and growing, hopefully, as they are as well. So when it's a deficit, what it's saying is you're not actually taking enough money in from those tax sources to meet all of the things you want to spend money on, so you're going into your savings account.
Okay, so maybe that's where, for me, like language-wise, I run into problems when we're talking about it. I mean,
Yeah.
because it's, you're saving money for a purpose. So if you have a whole lot, you're eventually gonna spend it on something, because that's why you're saving it, so that.
Correct. And I think that
that's
was
fine.
the position
That-
you all took
yeah,
a couple years
yeah.
ago, was to say, well, having this money just sitting in that savings account is maybe not the best use of
Yeah.
those dollars. And so that's why you started spending
Right,
it
right.
with it. So yes, that is, and that's why you'll hear manager after manager say, but don't spend it on
Right.
operating items, because it's a depleting resource. Once gone, it doesn't get added back in like your general fund dollars, hopefully do as you go forward.
So is that what we did?
You did it on
Doing
one
it
time, I mean, mostly one-time items, so,
Okay.
yeah. And, and I think there was something else that you said that I was gonna mention with that also. I'll come back to if I remember and stuff. But yes, that is kind of thinking of it in that way. The deficit piece. So, and this is where some folks will get confused because it shows up as red, and it is indeed red because it's beyond the general fund taxes that are coming in. But the budget is still balanced in the sense that you've got the money to actually cover all of the expenses that have been presented. Whereas if you think of the federal budget, which often is not balanced,
Right.
there isn't money actually, so they're borrowing money to actually make the budget work. We're not doing that.
Yeah,
This
and
is-
maybe that's where I get, like, the conflict between the thing that it's a balanced budget, but we have a deficit,
Right,
like.
right. Yeah,
Right,
and-
I kind of get what
yeah,
you're
and it's a
going
good,
there.
like I say, I think the way to think of it is what we're trying to buy exceeds what we are taking in taxes, so we're going to our savings account and putting money to it. And we've done that a few years in a row, and we're just at the point now where I feel like we're probably reaching the end.
And probably not good to be going into our savings account for groceries that we need every month.
That would be correct.
Like if we have to use a new roof, okay, but,
And of
That would
course,
be
in
correct.
contrast to us, the feds not only go below that purple line, they go below the floor.
yeah, they go, yeah, I
Yeah,
get it,
they really
okay.
do have a zero that they, yeah.
So it's not comparable.
So, the proposal that put forward, like I said, moves about $7.5 million of that savings, of that fund balance, to cover general capital kinds of items. In other examples I'll give you with capital, I've not gone into the level of detail that I have here, but I think it's important here that you see in that general fund use, so kind of the question that was earlier, what have we used that general fund before for? In this case, this is what we would propose to use that general fund for going, sorry, not general fund, the fund balance going forward with this. So that's where you see things like $3.5 million to try to continue to advance on our facilities life cycle. That's where you see IT equipment replacement. There are things in there about modernizing the jail security system. That's what those kinds of items are covered in this. You see that economic development capital item that I mentioned in there. So those are the kinds of items that would be used for that general fund. It's not the only capital, not even close to the only capital that we'll be doing for the year, but it's the capital that would be using that fund balance.
Am I correct in thinking that the previous managers' budgets did not use the fund balance, and then it was the commissioners who?
I believe that's probably accurate.
Right.
I don't know, was it ever proposed?
It was for fire trucks and.
For the fire trucks. Okay.
For the what?
So for fire truck purchases and some other things, there were a
That
couple
came
of
from
times.
from the.
Yeah, from the
okay.
manager's office.
And
Okay.
also in 2019, 4 million came out for the prosperity package. But when COVID hit, we used those dollars to deal with COVID.
Right.
But I do think the majority of the spend proposals for the fund balance have come from the commission with it. This is, I think we saw in this case, both the kind of past practice and just frankly, the reality that we either do this or we don't do these projects. And some of these projects you actually have to do, so what it really means is we'd have to actually remove funding from something else in order to be able to actually do some of these. The radio programs are a really good example of that. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this, the general fund, while obviously very important and the core part of the budget, it isn't the only part of the budget. And so I just wanted to kind of remind folks that that $7.5 million I just showed you is just a part of the capital dollars that are spent within the community. I think sometimes out there in the community, there's this misperception that there's very little capital work going on. There's actually a lot of capital work going on. And so there are a couple of areas that we've kind of put into the budget going forward. So some of you may remember, we've had this discussion about T-SPLOS 23, and that the way they're doing the account, or the way it appears that the accounting is going to be able to be done because the state law changed, or the state practice changed, I should say, is making available some additional funds that we had not accounted for. So we're actually able to take some things that we typically would have funded out of general fund capital and kind of move them into this category. And that's what you see up there around the safety improvements on the greenway. So think of lighting, security cameras, that type of thing in there. The bike and pedestrian improvements, those are going to be items of both on-street sidewalks, those kinds of things as well. Pavement, so part of the pavement program, pavement maintenance program in here, traffic safety improvement, bridge maintenance. Those are the kinds of things that we're anticipating funding out of that supplemental revenue as it becomes available. But the real money for capital comes in these other categories. So when you think of enterprise operations like stormwater and public utilities, those are the fees folks are paying through rates and charges. And then those turn into capital projects, and some of which you've kind of gotten some glimpse of, and you'll get more of with the service delivery plan, for example, in utilities. Over the course of 5, 6, 7 years, hundreds of millions of dollars will be spent out of that utility to do water mains, sewer mains, treatment plant upgrades, those kinds of things. Fees that are paid at the landfill go to the landfill. So when we purchase things like bulldozers, dump trucks, roll-off trucks, and so on, those are coming out of that account. Same with stormwater, airport, obviously all of those. So this slide is really not intended to go into any detail. It's just to remind everyone that there are other capital items. And that's where when I said earlier there was like 60-something million dollars kind of anticipated to be spent in capital, most of it's here. 7 million is coming out of the other, the general fund part of it.
And just, I want to talk to my colleagues, Bob and I talked about this on last Monday in our meeting, that we want to have more eyes on our enterprise fund, so we can see exactly the capital projects that we are doing, so the public can see also what we're doing. So I think it's vital that we understand how enterprise dollars are being spent, and to make sure that we be related to our constituents. Not everything is coming out the general fund, but we do have these enterprise funds, and I told Bob that we need to make sure that we have those dollars there so we as commissioners can see that, and we can pass this along to our constituents.
Yeah, and if everything goes well, what you'll see in your budget book, right now if you open it up to the capital page, it'll show you how those $7 million were spent, and a few other items in there. Ideally, multiple pages that will actually show everything that is being anticipated to be spent on capital, regardless of funding source. So you'll see those utility projects, you'll see the T-SPLOS, you'll see the SPLOS projects that are anticipated to be in. That way you'll have a fuller picture, and the residents will have a full picture of what is expected to be spent on capital, not just on the general fund piece. All that stuff's available, but it's not readily available.
Not in one place.
Yeah. Yes.
Bob, doesn't it also include the anticipated year the capital project will start, including the number of years it's anticipated that it would take to actually complete?
Yeah, so what you typically will see is like a 5-year kind of window with your capital. The one that you're voting on, if you will, are those general fund items in year one. Voters have
Right.
already approved the T-SPLOS and SPLOS projects, so we're just showing you kind of what would be done in year 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and so on. The other years, even in the general fund, are kind of indicators of what would be potentially spent over the years. And that's where in the past you all have seen, we've kind of plugged in like a $10 million number, because ideally, we would be spending $10 million on those deferred maintenance items each year and so on. So yes, that all will be in that
It's in
capital
the
section
section
of
of
the
the
budget.
capital.
Yep.
So what my last question is when inflation happens, is that number adjusted for the next?
Yes,
I mean, I
yes.
know, but I'm just, for
Yes, so
the
you'll-
public,
you
so
will
is it
see-
just for the next fiscal year?
Yes, you will see projects in a capital program, typically you will see projects move in and out of that 5-year list for a variety of reasons. Some of them are inflationary and it just, hey, now it costs more to build this building, so we've got to move something else out to an outlying year or off the chart, if you will. Sometimes it's something came up that you didn't expect, that a project, either something broke and needs to be replaced, or a project was generated from the community or from the commissioners that now kind of takes the place of something else on that list. So, ideally, it's as static as it can be, but the reality is it does move around over the course of the years as it kind of gets implemented.
Bids come in higher or lower
Yeah.
occasionally.
And ideally, those projects are all being drawn from plans and policies that you all have adopted, either through SPLOST, T-SPLOST votes. Think of things like the Leisure Services Master Plan. There's projects in there. There's projects in the Service Delivery Plan. Those have lists and lists of projects that should make their way onto the capital program so they actually get constructed or built. So.
I think I know, well, I do know that we discussed projects that have been on the books for a long time, and you've made, and I've noticed some efforts in my district, some old projects. Can we get a list of what is still outstanding? And will that impact our budget this year when stuff is all over the place?
Yeah, yes and no. So yes, we can get that information. It's predominantly, I think, going to be your list of SPLOST and T-SPLOST items. There may be some utility items that are in there, what we would kind of consider as carryover capital projects. Yes, we can provide that. The no part is it won't necessarily affect the budget piece of it, because they're either already funded and they're just kind of working their way through, or they're projects that haven't yet been funded and they're just kind of sitting there and there isn't funding available for them. One area where that might be a little bit different is we should, as we look at the service delivery plan for utilities, we should be looking at the list of backlogged, if you will, projects, and trying to make certain that those dollars are being spent timely, because that has an impact potentially on the rate, because the rate is set so it generates enough money to actually build those capital projects. And if those capital projects are languishing, you can start asking questions, was that premature in actually establishing that rate? So could be some impact with that, but that would be the one area I would think that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So other considerations, now we get into the stuff that's going to make everybody squirm a little bit. I apologize for this, but so thinking ahead, so thinking, okay, we're in what is probably the last year of our ability to go into fund balance, and we know revenues are slowing, thankfully growing, but definitely slowing. There's a lot of uncertainty out there. Inflation was starting to slow, but maybe picking back up again, at least in certain areas and stuff. So we need to start thinking about, okay, so how do we balance the budget as we look into the future, and or how do we spend the money that we already have budgeted slightly differently? And so some of these are kind of covered in that area. So I'm going to start with one of those things I think we need to not with this budget year, but as we move into kind of the year between this budget and the next budget, kind of talking about these things. And I think we need to start looking at the funds, my words, that are diverted from the general fund. So these are dollars that come in through one of those sources of taxes or charges or fees or what have you, that are then captured, never make it onto the general fund line that we're spending for operations, and they get moved to something else. So TADs are the good example. So there's a couple $1 million right now that are being captured in TADs that never go to the general fund because they're being held to be spent in those areas. Those are dollars that are not available to pay for pay raises. They're not available to buy general fund capital. They're available to do projects in those districts. And I'll come back to that thought in a minute. The Community Clean Energy Fund is set up somewhat similar in that money comes in through franchise fees, those dollars are captured and they're set aside, certain dollars are captured and set aside to be used for advancing on our sustainability objectives. That, and there's a base, as you all know, there's a base amount that still passes through the general fund, and it's the growth that actually continues to move. That growth it's one of the few revenue categories that is actually growing faster. So that growth is up to a few $1 million and expected to continue to increase in there. So it's an area, again, where those two, just using those two examples, there's about $6 million a year coming in that's being set aside and not used, not available in the general fund. So there's a couple of ways to approach that. One is, that's great, that's exactly what we want, and that's how it's gonna continue to be, and we work with that. The second is that, no, we need to kind of think about, should we still have all those TADs? Should we figure out a way in which those dollars don't get captured anymore? And should we look at a different way to approach the Community Clean Energy Fund? Not, again, to remove the dollars, but look at its growth and how you manage that piece. That's the second option. The third option is leave everything as it is, but be much, much more strategic about what you spend the dollars on, so that you look at the list of things that we otherwise can't afford, and we're using those dollars to do that. So if you've got a TAD, and that TAD is used to cover an expense that would otherwise be general fund that we can't afford, that's okay. I mean, it's getting the stuff built. It's if you use the TAD proceeds for something that is, from my words, extra beyond our normal kinds of expenditures, it may not be the best, most efficient way to use those dollars, because we otherwise could be using those to address other kinds of needs. So that's one category to kind of think about that I think we need to have some discussion in the upcoming year as we move toward the FY28 budget about how does this factor into that. Second, again, is to continue this conversation regarding reviewing discretionary funds allocated to outside agencies. Just so you all know, the budget that I'm handing over to the mayor that I'm proposing includes a reduction in the neighborhood leader program as one example, but it could be others. Again, I mentioned the community partnership program, it could be others in there. So there are partners that I think you all ought to be looking at and saying, can we still afford to do these things at these levels? Again, the answer could be absolutely, that's what we're committed to, no problem. It could be, maybe we need to adjust it in this way or that way with it. So that's the second one. The continued reorganization piece, I'm gonna continue to look at, are there ways to reduce the number of departments? You all know that I have talked about some of our departments that were moved, that were offices in the city manager's office that then became departments. Every time one of those moves out into a department, costs go up because it now requires a department director and other kinds of things. I think there are ways to bring some of those, to reduce some of those back into an office scenario and actually enhance their services. You know, I've talked with you all about people and belonging, for example, that it may make sense for that to come back in as an office with less people. So I don't need a director anymore. I can reallocate those dollars that went to the director and actually be much more targeted and focused on what it is that they do. That's just one example. There are probably some others also that I think as vacancies become available, we should reconsider, should those stay as departments or should they be adjusted? Maybe they could be absorbed in another department. Not all of them are gonna come into the manager's office, obviously. Same true with vacant FTEs. Some vacant FTEs, a position becomes vacant and immediately gets filled, no problem, we're not having a problem. All of our vacant positions are needed. We have some positions that have been on the books for 1,000 days because we just can't get those filled. And we probably need to look at those and say, should we try to repurpose those? And when we're able to figure out how to get them filled, we come back and address those as well and stuff. Commissioner Davenport, you had your hand up. So.
FTE, full-time employees.
Full-time equivalent, so yes,
Equivalent,
yes.
okay.
Think of them as full-time employees. Sorry, I tried to avoid acronyms and jargons, and that one I didn't, so, yeah.
And one more, Barbara, thank you
Sure.
for, I've been trying to get us to, ever since I've been on this commission about repurposing our FTEs, and I'm glad that we're looking at that. I think that can really be a help from a budget perspective. Like you said, especially when we're not filling those positions, they've been open for a long time, and repurpose those dollars pop somewhere that could give us some savings also.
Yeah, and, and the things I need to say about that are, we're not saying those positions aren't needed. They by and large are. We just can't fill them. Also, remember that in many of the instances, the savings is not a full savings because we probably already have removed the salary from it and only have the budget, the benefits, but it's an element of it. And the positions that I'm talking about are really the positions that report to the manager. So those are not positions, I'll let you all tackle positions that may report to other elected officials that are also consistently vacant. These are really the ones that report up to the manager that are kind of looking closely at. And again, in some instances, it may stay in the same department. It might be, even though it's an enterprise, I'll use utilities, for example. So public utilities has a high number of vacant positions because they have a very difficult time filling very technical positions, largely because their salaries are not where they need to be. But they have some other needs for positions that they've asked for new positions. Well, it doesn't make any sense to do that. So what we'll be doing is taking a couple of those long-term unfilled positions, repurposing them into the positions that they need. That's an example of the kinds of things that we would try to do to try to help balance those with the community.
So have we done any brainstorming on potential new revenue sources?
Some of which I think Commissioner Thornton just mentioned in terms of kind of one-off, if you think of like real estate kinds of things. You all have actually, a really good example of this is the inclusionary zoning components as an example. So one item I think we ought to also in this list consider is, should we expand the footprint of where that's available and possible? Because that has proven to be a pretty effective way to generate revenue for affordable housing. So that could be a way, rather than, because we don't have any money now to transfer money into the Affordable Housing Fund, but maybe we grow the footprint of where that's eligible to be able to use, to be able to actually take advantage of the inclusionary zoning so that you could generate more money. That would be another example associated with it. Back in the day, people would often ask about like grants and stuff. I mean, those are almost non-existent now, and very, very difficult, but we still pursue them. You all know that recently we got money that was a congressionally directed funding for one of our recreation centers, so we'll continue to pursue those. It just is becoming, I think, more and more difficult, not meaning we don't try or shouldn't continue to try it, but to try to identify new revenue sources.
So I'd love to see us challenge our departments, our boards and commissions, our community partners on some fundraising potential. I mean, I see in other communities, we do. I mean, we see our solid waste and public utilities have fundraisers. I'd love to see us expand on that. I mean, we do all these really awesome, Leisure Services is great at all these awesome community events. There's some way to monetize some small aspect of these events that could generate funds in addition to providing the free entertainment opportunity for the community.
Yeah, and there's,
Well,
good examples. A lot of
I'll pay
communities.
$25 to enter a costume contest,
Yeah,
those
and
kind
you'll-
of things.
And you'll see communities use like, naming rights for things as well, and stuff. We don't necessarily have anything, but we might, so there are ways that you can do a little bit associated with that, and I think we should, explore all of those avenues that we possibly
I
can.
mean, we do have these BACs of, citizen volunteers that are very passionate about these, even Athens in Motion, people are passionate about these.
I think a lot of those, think of a good example of this are foundations that you might have. A lot of libraries have foundations, parks have foundations.
Exactly.
And those are really good, they're good ways to raise money, kind of smooth the edges, if you will.
Yeah, our
So,
Greenway.
you might have a room that gets built by Splost at the library, and that room gets outfitted, its furnishings come from the foundation, as an example. You're not gonna build the room, and you're not gonna build a librry with those kinds of donations, but you could smooth out kind of
Yeah,
those,
exactly.
those unmet kind of things and stuff with it, yeah.
Yeah, and a couple
Yeah,
things,
pools.
also, we got the community, with the police foundation. I think it's a good
That's a
example.
good example, yeah,
Where,
yeah.
There's thousands of dollars in that foundation that really help us with the real-time crime center.
Yeah.
And from a structure standpoint, but also, I know this have not been popular, and Commissioner Thornton brought up earlier. Again, I think something that we maybe just look at, I'm not proposing that we do it, but impact fees, we're gonna continue to build student housing. Maybe there should be a cost to do that, but again, to Commissioner Link's point, we really want to raise revenue. that's one of the things that we could possibly take a look at and see, do they generate any dollars? But again, not saying that we should do it, just, maybe have that conversation.
Yeah.
See what that look like, and developers may not like that, but I think it's a conversation though,
Yep.
that we can have.
I want to remind everybody, again, back to the prosperity package, two of the things that were in a line item budget was grant writers. And the grant writers at that time specifically was targeting to
For human service kinds of need.
neighborhood leaders. That was the key thing, was neighborhood leaders. And now we're talking about, that's pretty much on the top level of the chopping block. But that was never supposed to have been in the, in the general fund. So I do want, and I admire when we get reports or we give awards, for example, leisure services. You can see where they go out and write grants and are able to do some things. We also see it with somebody else, I can't remember. But I do think grant writing is still a very popular source. I don't think that we did what we were intent, and there's a lot of reasons. So I'm not blaming nobody. There's a lot of reasons why that idea about the grant writers did not work out the way it should have. But there was an intent for grant writers specifically for neighborhood leaders, and neighborhood leaders was never supposed to have been part of the general budget
Yeah, and
from
we,
the start.
And we do have some pretty proficient grant writers kind of embedded in departments, but not standalone. And again, certainly we should pursue all of those. I mean, those are, really critical because in many cases, they're actually returning dollars to our community that otherwise taxpayers are paying for anyway. I do think that it's important to note, probably every one of those is going to, again, my description, smooth the edges.
Smooth the edges.
Yeah, they're not going to be structurally, we're not going to balance the budget off of grants or those kinds of, they help us do some things we might not otherwise be able to do, which is good. I mean, that's why we should pursue those as well. I don't have an answer for this, but I think there's a need for sufficient dedicated, sustained funding for life cycle items. The idea that we have to kind of every year sort of find money to be able to do that is just not sustainable. So you took a stab at that actually with the pre-designated items on the T-SPLOST, and I think you're going to need probably to look when the next SPLOST item comes up similarly to say, are there facilities that we own that we need to actually put out to the voters to say, we need to take care of these things? Should there be a line item in there that is always for these kinds of capital maintenance sort of items in there? Those are two examples, but somehow we've got to actually have a dedicated source. And that every year in that budget, kind of at the beginning, we sort of pretend we're going to find $10 million to go toward this, and we've never had, I don't think ever, $10 million to go toward this.
And roofs and heating and cooling is not getting any cheaper.
It is not getting any cheaper, and our buildings are not getting any younger. And of course, the longer and longer you defer maintenance, the more and more expensive it becomes. Commissioner Johnson?
So when you say life cycle maintenance, you're specifically talking about buildings, not cars?
No,
not
fleet would be in there and equipment.
Well,
So-
fleet usually has a monthly an apportionment that they put in for their life cycle, for their vehicles, or whatever equipment that they need. Are you suggesting that it just needs to increase
Yeah,
to
the
meet that need?
funding that we have dedicated to replacing fleets is not sufficient.
Not sufficient,
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why you all advanced kind of funding for the 2 fire apparatus, I think 3 fire apparatus ultimately
Okay.
with it, because we just can't keep pace with that replacement. And what we've really kind of shifted away from is sort of a internally funded model like you're describing, and more of a competitive annual capital model, which is usually not very sustainable. There's a few exceptions, like solid waste landfill have some ways to do some things that we can't do with the general fund. But yeah, it really just isn't, there's just not enough funds there. And that's true for computers, that's true for fleet, and certainly true for the components of our buildings as well.
Gotcha.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
I think one other thing we need to consider as we bring on new buildings, I just use the East Library.
Yep.
We got to maintain that. We got to have to hire people there. We got to maintain it. So we do a new judicial center. Same thing, we have to maintain. So our costs will continue to rise if we're building new buildings
Yep.
in order to serve our needs. Those are gonna be cost factors that we're gonna have to consider in the future, so.
And those will typically always show up on your capital program. It'll have in there what those would be. You know, I've always had this dream that I've never been able to achieve, which is, you know, in an ideal world, when you approved that contract for that construction, that new building, you amended the budget and added the dollars necessary to actually, and I say building, but it could be the Firefly comes with additional, the Bishop Pool, Park Pool came with additional, none of which have been funded.
Right.
We've actually not had the funding to actually add to those items, and, but yes, I think as we bring those items on, we need to be much more cognizant of
Right.
the costs that follow them, as well. And that's actually the last bullet, item on here, which is needing to be able to account for and budget, for those added, operational costs. I mean, the good part of it is, I'll use the Justice Center as an example. When we, you know, refurbish, when the new Justice Center is built and we refurbish the existing courthouse, that will enable us to leave, to surplus, a couple of older buildings that we have that carry with them maintenance costs. So we lose some of those costs that hopefully will help offset a little bit of the new costs in the now modernized buildings that are associated with it. But our buildings, the courthouse is gonna be bigger, so it also carries with it some additional costs associated with that, so.
Bob, is there a way with the SPOS and the T-SPOS projects, you know, the operational costs are all listed when the projects are submitted and when they're voted on and everything. Is there a way out there in local government world to sort of, I don't know, legislate or make into policy something where it just automatically, like you just said, like
Yeah.
your dream thing, like it just
Yeah.
like, we pass this policy and automatically, as soon as the thing goes in, there's a line in the budget and it's there. And
That's
we
how
have
I
to
feel.
take it out, like we have to take it out if we
I
don't
feel
want
the
it.
same way.
Yeah, I've never seen that. It would be, you know, it would be both responsible and nice to do, because, yeah, I mean, you could, the way you would do that is, you know, effectively, when you approve, use my example again, you approve the contract for construction of something,
Right.
you would, at the same thing, you would have budget ordinance to amend the budget to put into the budget, but you also have the dollars available to do that. That's why it's not often done, because it isn't as if the dollars are there at the same time. You would actually have to probably remove something else in order to fit that in, or you would capture some piece of new revenue that you would put toward it, and that's why it's usually not done.
Yeah, I mean, like in for the next budget, in
Yeah.
somewhere in this.
Yeah, I mean,
process.
what you would do is put a line item, you'd have to find dollars, put a line item in there to say, okay, we're anticipating these projects are coming online, we need this much operating dollars with it, which is just very difficult to do everywhere.
So I want to add to the difficulty. I was surprised when the gentleman spoke, when T-Splosh had not, I think he said this was the first time in 20-something years that T-Splosh was not approved through the advisory committee. If we're gonna come up with a life-sustaining project like the Greenway or the Firefly Trail, is there any way to know exactly how much it's going to cost? Because I'm sure, and we need to know what it's going to cost from the beginning to the end, and could those dollars or a percentage of those dollars be allocated right off the top of our whatever we expect? So that gentleman does not have to come back and put in an application. We know it may slow down the growth of it, but is it possible that a percentage, when we say we're going to make this much money, and 10% or 5%, whatever it is, could come right off the top, and that would go to finish with the work?
There's a piece of that happens with the SPLOS and T-SPLOS projects. So use Firefly, use a Greenway as an example, where there are certain things as a part of the T-SPLOS project that you can add to that, or it's a part of the construction. So, for example, lights, security cameras that are really ultimately going to become operational items because you have to replace them, maintain them, those kind of. Initially, they can be a part, just like you would put furniture in a building, same kind of thing. so initially you can get some of that in, not all of it. What you can't get in is the janitorial crew that now needs to be put in this new building, or the supplies that have to accompany the new building.
2 police officers out on bicycles.
Right.
Yeah.
Those are things that have to then come out of your general fund budget. And again, the reason I think historically those are not added is because the revenue's just not growing at the rate to take care of what you already have and add those pieces in. But you've described the quandary that exists as those new things come on, because what ultimately ends up happening, and again, it's not unique here, it's in many places, is the existing staff, the existing supplies, the existing resources get stretched to serve that. And probably for a slight bit of time, that works. At some point, you reach kind of a breaking point where now the quality of it starts to suffer, or it just becomes something that you have to fund. That tends to be, one of the things you see often is an item will come forward and it'll say, this would take a quarter of an FTE. Well, you're not going to hire a fourth of a person. And so you kind of stretch it out to a point at which it's like, okay, now we've got 4 of these, so we need a new person. But it still requires the dollars to be there to do it.
But as a close cousin to what you just mentioned, Commissioner Thornton, and reflective of what Bob mentioned earlier, I think when y'all look at the 2028 SPLOST, you probably want to be thinking like, all right, we've got some handrails and doors and HVAC units and roofs that probably ought to be a pretty big chunk of that package. So you've got somewhere in the $10 million range a year to draw from for those kind of replacement.
I would like for us to delve into that. Nobody wants the trails or the greenways to decay or fall apart if we've invested so much money up front. And I really think that when we did the T-Splosh and we took some money off the top, be able to take that off the top and let it be known that's what that is going to be. And because again, I'm not a real T-Splosh or Greenway person, but I do appreciate both, and I would hate that they have to come and always apply, like, everybody. So maybe there's a maintenance piece not on this budget, but as we move forward, we can make that pop.
Not much different than the paving money that the body approves every year, right? You don't just build a road one time, you're gonna have to come back again and again.
And I think there was a leisure services in the last SPLOST, like a updated maintenance, like a general thing that was.
Yeah, I think
in
it's
there.
with the athletic courts that have been redone, I think are using some of those dollars, and trying to make sure that we've got enough dollars in there and enough of that qualified stuff with it. I want to, on this slide, I want to come back to one item I mentioned earlier, and then I'll move to the last 2 slides. I mentioned earlier that the amount we were showing for projected revenue around property tax was the digest's kind of our best guess at the moment, that the digest will be finalized out a little bit further. And in the past, that has provided a little bit more funding. Don't know if it will or not. Hopefully, it's in that same situation. I would say if that is the situation as it becomes available, because I think often it even comes after the mayor has presented his budget, something to kind of consider is, one, that's a good source to kind of shore up the fund balance. In other words, use less of the fund balance because we get a little more money there. And the other is when I look at all the different folks that came and presented their proposals, there are a lot of very compelling reasons why we should provide more funding than we can. I mean, I think there are many needs that are still out there. The area that I feel like we've not been able to give the attention that we really needed to falls on the judicial side. And I'm thinking in particular, some of the courts themselves do have some needs for resources that we just haven't been able to fit in. So those are 2 things that I would say if the digest does end up generating a little more money than what we're projecting right now, kind of file that in the back of your minds, that those would be 2 areas that might be worth looking at as other considerations as you move forward with that. The next steps in the process, so today I began the process of handing over. I told the mayor this morning that it would be nice to be in a situation where tomorrow I can hand him a book and say, here, it's yours. We're not that far yet. There's still a lot of loose ends that I want to kind of tighten up to be able to hand off, and wanted to kind of get obviously get this in front of you so we can start hearing questions that you have regarding it. But so we'll be, over the course of the next several weeks, finalizing that. Obviously, in late April, or mid to late April, the mayor will deliver to you his budget proposal. Then, of course, you have a series of meetings with others, as well as yourselves in kind of work session settings, and then ultimately the vote. And in between there, we've got some other conversations that'll be going on around service delivery and some other things. And then right after that, in case this isn't enough, again, we'll have conversations about the Justice Center that will follow after this. May or may not have the service delivery plan approved at that point, very close to that point. And then, believe it or not, at some point, you'll be ready to start talking about the next SPLOST. So there's, after this, several additional conversations that are money in nature. But these are the next steps for the budget moving forward stuff. Yes, ma'am.
I did not see in your presentation ARPA interest money. Interest, is there any interest that is still?
It has all been. It's in the general interest part of it. So so it's showing up on that line for revenue. So on that revenue, so we can pull out in that general
If
interest.
you would pull
What
that
part is
out.
that? Yeah.
And the other thing that you said, and nobody's gonna throw tomatoes at you. You were thinking about the neighborhood leaders being a place where things kick. Well, first of all, they already know. They've been blowing out some of our phones up, and they're getting a lot of misinformation. Is there any thought about departments that have vacancies that some of these, whoever they are, if it goes that way, it may not even go that way, we may hire more neighborhood leaders, but is there some thought about other departments, not to just that's my thought.
Yeah, I mean, we are always looking for people in a variety of different
And
avenues
I'm
and
be
stuff,
honest
so,
with
yeah.
you, that should not have happened the way it did. It was, from what I understand, folk were crying and upset, and they were mad at all of us. But I am gonna respond because I was waiting to hear this today. But I do wanna put it out there that some of them do great work. This community would not be doing some things that they're doing for folk that traditionally is overlooked anyway. But I do want to put that out there, and I'm glad that we can clarify now that this was not a commission decision as of 2 weeks ago.
It'll be kind of a mayor decision, and then ultimately, if that comes forward, it will be your decision. And, I have sent out a communication to directors and others and stuff before this meeting, and I would say the same thing with this too, that, the reality is the needs in the community, the needs in the organization exceed the revenue that's available.
Oh, I get it.
And so folks should not take away, if we can't fund something, or if we have to unfund something, should not take away necessarily that what they're doing is somehow of lesser value. I mean, it really is a case of, I think all things being equal, we would fund all of these things to the extent that we're able to do so. It's trying to move all of those pieces around. And to your point, you all may decide at the end that that's not a piece you want to move. You want to move a different piece. And that's part of this process. For me, I had to start looking at, okay, well, where are we, in this case, where are we moving dollars of significance that are going outside our walls, and what can we suggest might need to be addressed differently?
I understand.
So, yep.
Got one here.
Oh, sorry. Yep, go ahead.
I just wanted to piggyback on that topic because I have thought that the sooner we talk about how that is less under our service area as the things that have been presented, that the connectivity, I think the neighborhood leaders have schools that are their district, and the sooner we talk publicly about this, the sooner the school district would take them on. And they have much more money than we do. So my hope would be that the discussions in the community would be who can help us out here. If the neighborhood leaders are helping out the families, which I think they are, more families with students in Clarke County School District, then that would be the continuation could happen when they talk about their budget.
Yeah,
That's
and
my
if,
thought.
and if I can make this even more difficult for you, so with those dollars, so essentially but there's a $1.2 million budget that goes to neighborhood leaders, and what I've looked at is 400,000 of that. So let me explain to you what that 400,000 would ultimately, potentially be able to go toward, to make it more complicated for you. So that would go toward taking what is a part-time position in corrections that is a social worker that aids folks that are actually moving out of the diversion center into making certain that they're able to keep and maintain their jobs to a full-time position. So that's one. The other is the library has made a substantial request for increase, a little bit of which is tied to the new branch, so some part of it would go to that. You have the youth programs for the recreation centers that are currently ARPA funded that will be coming off, and dollars could go toward that. You also have I don't remember what the other one that was associated with, the schools.
Partnership.
We're providing funding to the schools for partnership for youth recreation activities as well. So that really is the quandary. It's sort of like those programs that I just mentioned will go or underfunded if we don't find funding. It's not a great place to be to try to make those trade-offs, because I think they're all valuable.
So why are we giving money to the school district?
That was part of the ARPA arrangement, was that.
Well, that should be over with.
It is ending, and that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
If there aren't dollars that go toward that, those youth programs cease to exist. Those youth recreation
But I'm
programs.
saying, I would assume, because I would assume when we're making cuts, we're not gonna try to find money for the school district to replace whatever. we
Right,
cut.
and again, that will be, ultimately, that's just right now, kind of that proposal. The mayor will decide, does that make it into his budget? And if it does, then you all will make that. Because yes, that's the kind of trade-offs that we're at. I mean, it really is kind of that level of tightness, if you will, associated with it.
Patrick.
Well,
Oh, I'm sorry.
go ahead, Patrick. Yeah, come in.
So are other cities our size or bigger, smaller, are they facing the same issue that we're facing when it comes to budgets?
Yeah, it's certainly mixed, because so many communities are different than others, but there are definitely, all communities are experiencing declining revenues off of property tax, and I won't say declining, slowing revenues off of those. All communities are experiencing continuing increase in expenditures. And honestly, much of what we've even talked about here that is funded is largely because other levels of government are not stepping into that mix to increase funding at the state level or the national level. And so localities are sort of on the leading edge of trying to figure out how to address this. Think of things like homelessness, affordable housing, those kinds of things. Those are best done at scales that state and federal government can do, and in many cases, they're not actually investing in those. So yes, now, and we're fortunate, I think, here, in that our local economy is pretty resilient, and it is in the sectors that are growing. We also have a significant amount of our locality that is attracting folks from the outside to come in and spend their tax dollars here that a lot of communities don't benefit from when they come here for games, when they come here for even school. I mean, they're spending dollars in businesses and stuff. So yeah, pretty much, I think, what's being experienced in other places. Again, not universally. I think there's some that are far dealing with a lot more very difficult situations, and there are others that certainly probably have revenue that's coming in and haven't missed a beat.
So that would be because of HB 581. Has the Coalition of Mayors of Georgia reached out to ACCG to let state
Yeah,
legislators
there's been
know?
quite a bit of talk, both through ACCG and GMA. 581 is a ship that sailed. Obviously that had some revenue constraint attached to it. Those who've been watching kind of Bob's weekly updates or kind of my monthly updates have seen conversation about what had been House Resolution 1114 or House Bill 1116, which is still alive here in this last 4 days of the legislative session. And connecting with your kind of prior note, Patrick, some states have seen really significant revenue caps imposed by their state. So I was just with the Austin mayor, and they have more than a $25 million hole in their budget that they've got to figure out how to close. And, connecting with Bob's comments a moment ago, a lot of that is they're going to have to see not only sort of human services sorts of reductions, but even some basic governmental public safety kind of activities that are constrained. Similarly, in Florida, the state has constrained the kind of transfers that can go from a city's electric utility to that city's general fund. So we're in a national environment where there's some version of this conversation happening in dozens of places.
I just think that's important that we tell our constituents that, when we are facing these budget cuts, it's just not us, it's other communities as well. Bob, just two more questions.
Sure.
TAD, were you alluding to, or could we end a TAD?
That is a conversation that if we move into the conversation about should we even look at how we use TADs or don't use TADs or this kind, would be a conversation that we need to actually explore further. Because some of the revenue that's captured probably stays captured. I don't know the answer to that yet. That would be a part of, if there was a desire to have that conversation, a part of what we would do with the attorney's office and others to kind of talk through and say, what are the options as you move forward? And some of them, there's many of them. Some of them may make perfect sense to stay exactly as they are. Others may not. It may not be a wholesale kind of decision as you go forward in that. So, yeah.
Okay, I would recommend that we got a user group that we at least honor some of the requests that the people in the community ask for. Last question. Employee pay is very big on that because I think we have the best employees in the world. I'm showing a 4.6, I believe that's correct, million. Is that would include the annual usual 3 and 4 market and performance?
Yeah, it actually ends up, if you take all of the dollars, it's somewhere over $8 million is what it would take to achieve what we're kind of proposing, which is essentially a 4% up to a 4% pay increase for general funds, plus move the pay table 3%. Also then moving the pay table for public safety 3%, and then taking care of all of their next step increases. Then you'll remember that we actually budget, we only budget based on the number of positions filled at a specific date, time. And we know that's not real, so we also have to add money to that for positions that are vacant that will become filled. So it's like $2.5 million that goes toward that. So all in, it's around $8 million. Not all of that's funded by the general fund, obviously, because you've got folks in stormwater, you've got folks that are in, utilities, those kinds of things. And there's some funding that was baked in the current budget year that hasn't, for compensation, that hasn't been fully used, that we can in effect carry over into the next year. So all of that's kind of in the background, and essentially what we're striving for is to see if we can get to that 4% number and the 3% number. That's the target.
Okay, I still have more questions, but thank you for that.
Sure.
Go ahead, Melissa, I'll go last.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to impact fees. From what I understand, the state pretty strictly regulates how we can charge impact fees, what they can apply to, if we charge a developer an impact fee, it has to be spent on something that directly impacts that development, correct?
Yeah, I mean, typically what you would see are, places that would use impact fees around utilities or around streets or, something to
Parks,
that.
libraries.
Yeah. And it goes, and of course, in the case of utilities, it's not an impact fee, but there are connection fees that folks have to pay that are designed to replace capacity that they're using. It's probably the best example of what's baked into the utility rate structure.
So in core and stepping up to replace that sewer pipe, is that considered an impact fee, or is that just like them volunteering?
Yeah, it was really, the description that I would use is referred to as a proffer. So it's really something that as they negotiate it, the agreement on how that property could be developed, because we were bringing things to the table. Also, we had land and some other kinds of incentives attached to it. They offered up voluntarily to step in and address that issue, which was ultimately going to be addressed by utilities, but not in the timeline that they were pursuing. And so in that case, they certainly benefited from it because it lets the project proceed in the schedule that they were looking for. And ultimately, the ratepayers benefit some from it also because it's a cost we can defer that otherwise would have been borne by the
So
ratepayers.
could we have charged them an impact fee for us to do the work? Would that be a situation where that would have been legal to apply?
Yeah, you would not be able to do an impact fee in there, you know. If you were negotiating a development agreement, there's all kinds of options inside that development agreement. I think actually at one point at the core project, there was discussion of, well, if the utilities is gonna do it, you know, they, in effect, utilities doing it, and that counted on our side of the ledger. But I think the timeline just didn't work out for them.
So it was more about the timing.
And very generically, the impact fee both has to have the metrics for revenue and then the ultimate source of that revenue too. So you've got to have both sides of the ledger accounted for in your ordinance. And it's got to apply uniformly, so, you know, you can't pick winners and losers, like, I like this development, I don't like that development.
Yeah, and again, when we talk about trying to increase revenue, just a thought. Nothing, I don't want nobody writing and say, Commissioner Fisher said we need to do impact fees. We're talking about how can we maybe have more revenue, you know, that can help the community. And I think I've told you all, though, several months ago that we knew it was gonna be a tight budget year. And I think we need to continue to keep that in mind as we go through this process and see what the mayor's gonna present us. I do wanna emphasize, you know, we talk about the Neighborhood Leaders Program, but we also got other nonprofits that's not quasi, agencies that's in our general budget too.
Yeah.
So I think we have to look at the whole spectrum.
Yeah, and I
just don't wanna.
Yeah, when I
single
put
them out.
that, yes, and when I put that item up there, you know, again, just as examples, so 1.2 million neighborhood leaders, $1 million to the community partnership program, which are all the nonprofits that you all just looked at as well. There's $100,000 that goes to housing counseling, which is, those are all general fund dollars.
Right.
And those are all going to someone else, again, all doing worthy work.
Right.
But certainly would include that in the discussion.
Right.
The mix, and it really, you know, if you're gonna go down that path, it probably
Right.
makes sense to look at it wholesale.
And that's my point. I think we need to look at all that.
We haven't talked about we've just mentioned the House bill, what is the current version
Yeah, the
that's is
1116.
1116, right? And, you know, I've sort of been waiting till the final version to see what comes out of that there. I do know that at the Northeast Georgia Regional Commission meeting, all the surrounding county representatives from counties that are very red are very much against this on an individual level and communicating on that. But my gut feeling right now, from what I'm picking up, is that it would have a larger impact on our school district here. Is that from you guys than it would on us?
A revenue cap model would, I mean, certainly the school district has a less diverse revenue portfolio than we do. There's an enormous amount, well, two things are true. There's an enormous amount of lobbying going on from all local public sector institutions, and certainly even from the business community, given that at least one iteration, because the text changes about every other day, of House Bill 1116 would shift the benefit of what's currently LOST that applies to all properties to just homesteaded properties and be an L host. And so that would mean that every commercial, industrial, and rental property would see a significant tax increase.
Yeah, it's in its different versions, it's kind of an interesting, there's multiple steps in it. So including that in order to fully affect what it is intended to do, there'd actually have to be a period of which the millage rate would increase, where in order to offset a piece that would then get recovered to some degree with those L-host kinds of funds. It's not very clear. Probably other communities have even bigger problems than we would have because they don't have the ability to actually generate the amount of sales tax necessary to replace the loss in the millage, the property tax revenue, and the communities that are in counties where there's multiple municipalities, it's not even really clear how the revenue would get shared among those. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And I would say that if it were passed in anything resembling the forms that it has been presented previously, probably everything I put up there as other considerations could be removed and just replace it with that, because it would fundamentally change the revenue that is and is not available, both at the school level and at our level as well.
So once this thing gets settled and voted on or not voted on, we're gonna have
We'll get a memo.
we're gonna get a memo that goes over this because, there's been a big push among colleagues here about reducing millage rate, and it doesn't really seem like a great time to be even thinking that way when we're cutting things. So I want to make sure that we know all the facts about what the next year will bring.
Yeah, and we are certainly working under, and I didn't say this earlier, but we're certainly working under the assumption of what's being proposed and handed off to the mayor, that there is no change up or down in the millage rate. So,
Yeah.
obviously,
Yeah.
that was a conversation.
I agree with that. I think we'll keep it as it is.
Static.
Yeah, good.
Yes.
May I please read something that I wrote to make sure I understand what I wrote, and if it's accurate, okay? Then I have maybe 2 to 3 follow-up questions. So on the page, I think before, at the bottom where it says other considerations, you made a
Oh, the other,
comment.
yeah, I get that one.
And what I wrote, and I was writing quickly, is about $6 million. The first bullet you were talking about, that referencing that, the $6 million could be used to transfer to the general fund.
If those.
For example, to replace
Yeah, if
salaries. Is
those-
that what you said?
If those tools didn't exist as they do today, that is $5.5, $6 million of revenue that would otherwise just flow directly into the general fund. They don't and can't right now because of the way that those are structured.
The TADs are structured?
TADS and the Clean Energy Fund, because you direct a certain amount of those dollars into the fund with it. So if they didn't exist, that would be the level of funding that would flow through in this upcoming year.
Okay, I guess I might be confused, but I
And
I
we've
know a
got-
little bit about TADs, and I do know that TADs can only be used for project-based, not salaries.
Right.
But like project-based.
Right, so if the TAD didn't
They're just-
exist, the
Okay.
revenue that would be generated would just flow into the general fund. It's
How would
being
it be
captured.
generated without the redevelopment of from the benefit of the TAD?
Because what the TAD is doing is it's actually capturing revenue that is being generated in that district. The idea is that the investments that are being made generate more revenue because it's got more development in doing that, but it isn't creating any new revenue itself. It's just capturing revenue that's actually being held in that district that would otherwise pass through the general fund. The mall one's a little bit different too, because it's also capturing school dollars that are being kept in that same district that would otherwise flow to their general fund. But it's not generating any new revenue. There's no new revenue, it's just capturing that revenue.
And so just to use one example of an existing
Okay,
TAD,
okay.
that North Avenue TAD, that's kind of where that big U-Haul center is, it has a property that really hasn't changed at all, but it's certainly increased in value. Well, that increase in value over the last 5 years is captured within that zone. And if the TAD didn't exist, it would just be funding the general fund stuff.
I guess what I'm saying very slowly, if the TAD didn't exist, then there would not be redevelopment. So if there were no redevelopment, there would be no revenue growth.
Correct,
Am I wrong?
conceptually, what the TAD is supposed to do is, it is making available opportunities to make investments that would stimulate
Revenue
redevelopment
growth,
and
right.
development, and then the revenue growth. That's the idea. And if the funding is used in a way that doesn't achieve that, then you're not realizing that full potential. And we haven't even gotten to the point of actually investing any of those dollars yet. So yes, I mean, that's the idea. Part of that discussion is, would some of these areas that we have in TADs right now, for example, actually redevelop or develop along the path without the TAD? That would be also
Sure.
a question, so yeah.
But I did see an exception, like in reading, like 5 or 6 or 7 months ago, where TAD funds could be used for general fund or salaries for positions that assisted or worked solely on the tab, like planners, like what you said earlier, planners, engineers.
Yeah, I mean, a
those
good,
type of folks, they
you know-
could be paid, their salary could be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's communities, for example, that use a TAD in a downtown area, for example, and that it would be perfectly acceptable and fairly common that, you know, you might have a Main Street manager that's actually funded through the TAD piece because they're actually a part of what's trying to generate that
Part of the
economic
TAD,
activity.
right.
Yeah, yeah. What you wouldn't be necessarily able to do is, those aren't dollars that are flowing through to fund for firefighters and, you know, salary increases, those kinds of things.
Thanks for the clarification.
Sure, sure.
Are TADs also generating interest when they're not being spent? And are they separate from?
the revenues are being held, so they're generating interest, yeah.
So the same, so it would be in that general revenue?
And that interest earned, right.
in the TAD fund, so that interest earnings off the TAD money.
In the TAD.
Okay.
And we will have, so I didn't mention this earlier, and this kind of be my sort of conclusion here, is that over the last couple of years, I think with Sarah's help, you all have been provided kind of a series of answers to questions, and we'll be doing that again. So in particular to this issue with the TADs, one of the things that we'll provide you is kind of a table that shows what each TAD has generated in revenue, where it kind of sits currently within it. The same will be true, we'll show you what, just using these two examples, the climate fund, what it's been able to generate and where we project it's headed going forward. I mean, if there's other funds that, I've just identified those two, if there are other areas like that, we'll include that information also if you know those. But, so those, we will continue through this process much like you've done before, which is providing as detailed an answer to those questions as we possibly can. If questions arise in between, we'll also include that in that discussion as well with it. So that is everything. Does anybody end with the end, which was the same slide that you saw earlier at the beginning? Again, you know, if I was summarizing, I'd say good news is revenue continues to grow. Moderately bad news is it grows at a reducing rate or slower, and expenses are growing at a faster rate than that. And sort of the caution is we've probably exhausted the current way that we've dealt with that. I think we can make it through FY27 with that approach in some fashion, but we need to probably spend more than we would normally between the two budget years talking about how we get ready for FY28 if that ends up being the case. Thank you all. I appreciate
Do we have times on the other meetings already set? Are they in the calendar?
I think they're scheduled.
You had with the 14th, 21st, you had the time, you had the dates up there.
5:30 to whenever you do it.
Okay.
And there'll be a planning, there'll be a
Then
planning.
at 5:30?
The budget meetings typically start at 5:30 and whenever.
The first meeting, the first one is a day of like, of the work session. Is that gonna be I mean, I always get confused about that. Is that,
Yeah, I think to the extent we're able to, we would probably try to preempt as many work session items as we could so that you can focus on budget.
Right.
so on that day, it would be at the work session time, not the 5:30 time? Like on the, I think May 12th is a Tuesday.
Yes, some years we've done both, topical
Yeah.
work session in the afternoon and a budget session in the evening. I'd be glad to just restrain our focus to the budget session in the evening.
Yeah, and Sarah was just saying, we'll resend the list with all of the dates and times too, so that you have that.
Great.
You may already have it in, actually, I don't see it on the calendar, so.
I have a comment. Is it possible, I mean, not is it possible, will you please provide the materials to us or publish them online in advance so that we have a more meaningful discussion instead of just listening?
Yeah, typically through this process, that's exactly what I would do. This one was literally, as of this afternoon, we were still finalizing this piece. So yes, the intent would be, as we go forward, to try to get, for example, answers to the questions, you get those way in advance as we kind of progress through
No,
this.
no, not the
Yes.
presentation, not answers to the question, like
Yeah.
like what we got
Yeah.
today on the table.
Yeah, at least the parts that we control, certainly that would be the intention to do so, yes, yes.
And I notice now now it is available publicly.
It is.
Before it was just the first.
Yeah,
page,
it-
so that's.
So you have questions and but you could only listen, and you can't listen and then, you know, just evaluate what your thoughts are and what you think you know and what you do, what you know. But if you have a chance to read it in advance, we are prepared.
Yep.
And
If I
I-
had it in advance, I certainly would have done so, yes.
Thanks.
Yep.
All right, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.